I said, if they were reimagined such that they no longer resembled the country, resembled what we know as policemen in any capacity right now, and then they were still able to be functioning and recognized by the government in that situation, then they could be not corrupt.
All right, so Lil Minus, well, get started. So, to my audience, once again, we are back. We're going to do a debate about whether the police are inherently corrupt. Right. So, we had been, I forget how we got on the subject of the police previously, and me talking about the failures of the DC police for the insurrection. I forget how, but during our previous debate, our previous panel. These two got into it on that topic. Polar here does not think they are inherently corrupt, right? And Fanatiq absolutely does. So I'll give you guys an introduction each as to all yourselves and your positions, and then we can go from there. So I guess we'll start with Fanatiq.
Yeah, I feel like in order to try to get a good understanding of what the police are, in order for me to have my perspective, I think I did kind of a search of the history of the police and why they were created, what they've done since they've been created, and if there's been any change in what essentially makes up the police and their constitution and their character. I guess namely because of the disagreement that we had over whether or not they were inherently. And so then using Merriam-Webster to find the definition of what inherent means. Inherent is involved in the constitution or essential character of something. And so then I started trying to figure out what is the essential character of police. Not the talking points used typically by politicians in order to smooth over some of the nonsense and atrocities that are happening from police, but specifically what is their character, what is their intent, and what is their constitution. And the more I searched, the more I started finding that it's actually absurd how corrupt the police have always been and what they've specifically been used for all of this time, such that I think, whereas I've always talked about reforming the police, I feel like there's only so much reforming before you recognize that you're literally creating an entirely different entity, and I think that's probably the only way we'll find a solution so that the police will be able to interact with the rest of society in some sort of amicable way.
Okay. All right. Polar.
Yeah, you said this was introductions. Yep, my name is Polar. I do political content on the internet. I'm streaming a lot more, trying to do some IRL, like real political organization and environment. I am on the side that the police are not inherently corrupt, and that's what I'm probably going to go into right now. So I have a feeling that this debate is going to deal a lot with definitions specifically, right? And what inherent and corrupt means, right? So I think Fanatiq brought up a really interesting point as to what police are. Right. And at least when it comes to talking about inherent, right, involved in the Constitution is a very important point. Right. When we think about that, when we think of the government, for example, the Constitution, inherent powers are powers that are present that if are not present in that Constitution are not is not that thing anymore, right? So the philosophical understanding of this is the major one is that inherent literally refers to something that is stuck in something else so firmly that they can't be separated. So I think that's very important when it comes to this kind of debate. And that's, I think, what we're going to spend a lot of time talking about, as well as what the police are, when they've started, what their actual background is, and then how we can move them forward. So yeah. Fanatiq, you're in the affirmative, so I would like to hear your arguments for as to why they are corrupt inherently.
Muted.
Sorry. Check. There we go. Sorry about that. In order to do that, you probably would need to go historically through what they are, as you mentioned, and I think where they came from. And so what I started researching, the first thing that I discovered was that police really early, they started out as slave. They started out specifically to suppress slaves. So before police existed, they had this thing. There's something called the constabulary, which was basically an individual constable who oftentimes was completely unarmed, and it wasn't so much about like policing necessarily. They really did just kind of like they would watch the jail. They would be night watchmen, kind of, to make sure like that they just watched over a town at night to make sure that they weren't being like invaded and things like that. And that's kind of what the constabulary did. They were really unofficial positions, and they didn't, that it wasn't like a police. But that was the closest thing that we had, and that was the way society functioned. Then in around 1704 is when the South saw the rise of slave patrols, who their task was to capture, control, brutalize enslaved people, and they were required to serve like a little 2-year sentence, and they would get paid, but they would get fined if they weren't if they didn't show up, or if they weren't doing their job, then they would be fined for that. During that time, it wasn't, again, there was no official police. They were slave patrols, and they functioned similarly with African Americans the way police did. But they were, again, it was a semi-unofficial position. But what there were slave codes, and in these slave codes, all folks, including children, were expected to uphold them, and they were to return slaves. And the slave code laws basically were there to prevent slave people from organizing or rebelling. That was like the entire purpose of them. And that is what the model of policing was created from. It was originally about slave owners protecting their property and making sure that blacks were not able to organize and able to run away, and that's been their creation. That was the way they started, and then just moving forward really quickly. It shouldn't be that much longer. Immediately once the blacks were freed, once there was after the Civil War, when blacks were freed, at that point, then they created these extremely broad vagrancy laws. And these broad vagrancy laws made it illegal for any black person who like refused a job, or if you turn down like a really horrible offer on a job, or if you walk away from like a bad land deal, then you immediately became a criminal, because if at any time you were unemployed or did not have a place to live, you were considered vagrant. And police were specifically created during that time to enforce these very wide vagrancy laws, which then allowed them to criminalize black people for being free. And they literally oppressed and codified all black forms of freedom against them, such that then blacks could then be incarcerated and then sold back to the slave masters as prison labor through the convict lease system. And that is where police, like the police that we know and understand, started. It kind of shifted from a constabulary and a sort of a unofficial slave patrol to an actual police, where they were like codified law enforcement and got sanctioned by the governments that and the powers that be to start oppressing, and they were extremely violent with blacks. It's important to note that prior, when we did have constables and things like that, the American societies were very, very much against any arming of any sort of police. They felt that that would be oppressive to them, and that it would interfere with armed militia, which were really important to America during that time. And the idea that so they were very much against police being armed or militarized in any way. But when it came to African Americans and slave patrol, and then when it came to the enforcement of the Jim Crow and the slave codes and all those laws, during that time they made it so the whites did not care about them being unarmed, and they were allowed to be as violent as they possibly could be, and they did so, and it was pretty harmful. And I don't really see very much of a change from the way police were there in their inception and their intent until now.
Okay, so to clear up some points specifically, right? The first actual act of policing, we actually have to define what policing is, right? So,
Sure.
Police the current consensus made by multiple sociologists in the field is that the police are a group that have the legal competence to enforce coercive, non-negotiable measures to resolve problematic situations, right? This is actually what all police forces have in common. And yes, this would actually apply to things like private police and other forms of military powers as well. And so when we actually look at the history of America, right, you're right that like slave patrols did exist, right? And I'm never going to disagree with that. But policing was actually initially provided by local elected officials. For example, one of the oldest aspects of this was in Albany County. No, it was Albany, New York, where they had county sheriff's departments that were elected and that would work with local militias in order to protect the community. Yes, while I agree that some codes did come from the slave patrol, I disagree that police derive from the slave patrols, as slave patrols were present in the Carolinas, as well as years later, we had the first example of city police, right? In places like Philadelphia in 1751, Virginia in 1807, and Boston in 1838, that specifically focused on protecting the city and engaging in the city. So a lot did derive from slave patrols, but the police and the concept of them did not derive. A lot of what we consider law and our practices actually come from the English common law, which is where we actually get a lot of our law initially. And that's something that I'll go into later. So I would disagree with your first statement, saying that like all we know now, like the first example of this came from the Carolinas, which I disagree with. And yeah, that's my policing definition, right? So if we want to go by that, I mean, like police in and of itself, the concept of police is a very, very abstract definition because, as we all know, there's a lot of local police departments in America that engage in completely different ways. Yeah, and it's very hard to find something that is actually in common with all of them.
Sorry. So you have to help me understand this. You said that you disagree with the fact you cited that police were in Boston in the 1830s and Philadelphia
Mhm.
and so on and so forth. And the thing that I cited predated that by almost a century. And I don't understand how then.
Sure.
So then, explain to me how you would be able to make the assertion that these two were not correlated or associated or weren't derivative in any way.
So, as I was specifically mentioning, you mentioned slave patrols, for example, and the way that they engaged, whereas
Hmm.
city police engage in completely different ways that focus on specifically like engaging with the city. Those actual protocols derived from places like Albany, like I initially talked about, rather than some of the actual aspects that engage when it came to slave patrols and slave codes. And this, we actually see this later in the 1800s as well, where they were specifically focused on making sure that the city was well kept,
Okay, but that's
even though they
absolutely
were highly corrupt.
so one that's absolutely not true. So what we ended up seeing was that literally the slave patrol existed while the police existed in Boston, the police that you're talking about, and long, long before, and continue to exist there, and they were functioning similarly. I don't understand what you're talking about. So the slave patrol started in 1704 and existed all the way until 1865, and then and they weren't made illegal until 1865. Once they were made illegal in 1865, then they had official police who were literally just there to enforce Jim Crow laws and so on and so forth to continue to oppress people. But the two were absolutely correlated,
So
specifically when it came to African
you need to prove
Americans.
that you need to prove that they derived from it, though. Those specific codes and those specific practices derived
Well,
from slave patrols.
so when we recognize that the way, so when the police, the very first official police it was in Boston. I'm pretty sure the very first official police station. Prior to that, again,
What do you mean by official?
uh, that there was never there weren't prior to there being police station and official like whatever, like, so you had again like maybe an elected person of a town that didn't have any like governmental powers, like it wasn't, they weren't like a recognized party within the government. People were pretty much
Yes, they were.
people were pretty much policing themselves, and then they didn't become
No, there were.
the very first police.
That's not
I'm pretty
true.
sure the very first police station was in 1830 in Boston. Prior
Huh?
to that, there were no police
You
stations. Correct? Or
But what the police? Wait, police. Wait. Police stations. Just because there's a police station doesn't mean that that's the first signification of the existence of police from that point on. As I mentioned,
prior to that,
policing is extremely broad.
it was basically constabulary. No, okay. So I see what the problem is. So what you're doing is you're applying the definition of a word and then applying that towards maybe the ideas of these other elected officials who weren't called police at the time, like constabularies or constables, and then saying, well, so constables technically were police, and then now we're going into a whole different direction. So hold on, when I defined what the constabulary was, and then went on to start describing what policing was, clearly there was a distinction between those two things. You can't then take a broader definition that talks about just in general what the idea of policing is, and then apply that before police even existed. They weren't officially policed; they were constables prior to I think 1830 in Boston.
So police have existed far before the U.S. existed,
Sure.
Right? The word police, like that's specifically what I'm talking about.
Sure.
The reason why I brought up that specific definition is because policing and the way that the government interacts with the civil aspect of law enforcement is completely abstract. So before the word police was there, police did exist.
No. Okay.
That's the point that I'm...
So we have police now, like an official thing recognized by the government called police, okay? And prior to that, we did not have the official thing recognized by the government as police. We had a constabulary, which was different than police.
So specifically what I'm talking about are local elected sheriffs that would specifically work with local militias. And if you consider that a constabulary, that still acts as some form of policing.
So it is a form of policing, but it is not a policeman. It is not an official policeman. There's a distinction between a constabulary and a police, because the constabulary was an unofficial thing. Even though they were elected by their local town, they didn't have any.
What do you consider official?
If they got any sort of, if they were recognized by the state.
What do you mean recognized? They were recognized by the state.
They weren't recognized by the state. They weren't recognized by the state or the federal government.
What does it mean to be recognized by the state?
So once we started having official policemen, once we started having, I'm explaining it. You're asking me a question.
Sure.
Okay. Once we started having official policemen, like in Boston, where at that point, the police started working and functioning with the mayors and with the governors of the states. Then they started having specific budgets that were by the state and that were by the state. They then had there was codified law that mandated how exactly they were able to function. All of these things start becoming official interactions. If me and a group of my friends decide to elect an individual as a policeman, but then the government doesn't recognize them as having any power, and no one outside of our circle recognizes this person as having any power, that's what I would mean would be unofficial, and that's the way the constabulary functioned.
So then I think we have a disagreement on what police are. Right. So can you redefine what police are? Yeah. Can you go into your definition of police once again?
Sure. So police are an elected body meant to enforce an elected body that is recognized by the government, by the state and federal government, that is used to enforce whatever laws and whatever laws that they choose to, whatever laws the government wants them to do. Or the powers that be.
So this necessarily disagrees with the definition of what most sociologists in the field and criminologists agree on what police are. As I mentioned, they have the legal competence to enforce coercive, non-negotiable measures to resolve problematic situations.
Sure.
And therefore,
so you're talking about a broad definition. You're talking about a broad sociological definition as opposed to the legal definition, which is where the distinction comes. So hold on. We can't be talking about legal, recognized, constitutional police officers, and then you're trying to talk about a broad definition of what policing is, and then try to use that, because in your definition, based off of the sociological definition, then people like, for example, security guards would actually be police, because security guards have the ability to police by that definition. But we also recognize that a security guard and a policeman are very distinct things, and they're not recognized by the government as having the authority to police, as policemen have the authority to police. There is a distinction there. That's why you can't appeal to your broad sociological definition and apply that to a constabulary and then hope that the two coincide enough such that you can just get away with that. That's not the way that works.
So specifically, the reason why I bring up and the reason why it's broad is because police and policing is extremely diverse and different no matter where you go, right? You brought up this legal definition. Sure. Where is that legal definition from?
I don't know. We can Google it if you want. Yeah, fine. Let's just do that.
Sure.
Let's get a legal
But
definition
like,
of
yeah.
police.
So sure, like, and there are specific reasons as to why that policing definition is even used.
Well, sure, of course, because if it's going to be represented, if it's going to be recognized by our government, it has to have a legal definition. They do the same thing with when it comes to religion. They do the same thing when it comes to any recognized governmental bodies.
Sure.
Like
So
that.
so
That's just the way things be.
go
They have to have a
go
definition.
into
Sure.
yeah, go into how they do it though.
Um, Typically, there are laws written about them within a code of conduct, and then that's when they become official bodies. Like there's a
Okay.
law that's written that governs Congress. That's how it became an official body. There's a law that recognizes a governor. That's how they becomes an official body. So on and
Sure.
so forth. Like
So then
anytime
when it
anything is
comes to
going to be
safety
recognized by
laws,
our government, it has to have a legal definition. You cannot then appeal to a broad sociological definition and then hope to God that that happens to
what's
coincide
the
enough.
military? Wait, Fanatic, what's the military?
Um, it's a governmental it's a body recognized
Sure.
by our government used to specifically enforce.
Do you think you can have private militaries?
Sure, yeah, you can.
Yeah, yeah. So, for example,
But then they would no
the
longer
re-
they wouldn't be recognized by our government.
but they'd still be militaries.
Sure, but if we're talking about, okay, so this is why again I keep making this distinction, because any person, I can choose to create a police of my household. This person is a police in my household, and then at that point, then that's what that person can be. But there's a difference between a legally, this is where I keep wanting you to understand, a legally recognized position versus just something that somebody wanted to create at their own whim and submit themselves to at their own whim, like a constabulary. They're
If a
very
local
different.
if a local government authorizes an individual to act within the law and enforce that law, would you consider that individual a policeman?
If a local government acts so and they're doing so outside of the realm of what is legally provided by our government or legally codified by our government, no, I would not consider that person a
But
policeman.
that's a local government. If that government codifies it and allows that individual to act and use like force to enforce the laws that are present, that individual isn't a policeman. Does it have to be recognized?
The local government can only give someone the ability to be a policeman within the powers and within the scopes defined by our government. If they do anything that stands outside of the government, then their will is superseded by the Constitution and by our federal government, which then which wouldn't allow those people to do this. For example, I'm gonna give you a quick example. We have laws that protect the rights of individual citizens. The only time that people can do specific things that usurp those rights is if they have legal powers provided by the government. For example, if I decided I'm going to arrest a random person, then that's it. That's illegal, right? What I get
Sure.
charged with false imprisonment, right? Because I don't have the ability or the jurisdiction to imprison another person. The only person that can imprison another person is someone that's been given the right to do so by a state government, by a state in general, right? And so it doesn't matter what an individual decides to do. If ever an individual decides to do something that violates the state, then at that point, then that person will go to prison for that. So if a group
Sure.
of people decided we're going to make this guy the police of this block of our street or whatever, and then a visiting person decides to do something, and then that person that we decided was going to be the policeman, decided to like imprison that person or hold that person or do any of those things, that would be a violation of that person's constitutional right. So while that person would be, by your sociological definition, policing, they would not be recognized by our government, they would not be recognized by the state, and they would not have any actual jurisdiction to violate any of these typical constitutional rights. So yeah,
Okay.
they would be a police by your definition, but they would not be an
Yes.
official police.
So if they violate the state's definition, they go whatever the state says, right? They're not a policeman, right?
Sure. And if they violate any of the federal government's legal definitions and jurisdictions.
So in the case of Albany, right? They weren't violating any form of federal government's like a jurisdiction. They were authorized by the local government to do this, right? The same way, and it actually derives from common law of England, right? That's the way that they actually engaged in England as
Sure.
well. So specifically, right, if they're authorizing an individual to become a policeman or work in policing, and the state is allowing them to do that, that'd be the first presence of police in America.
What year was this? You talking about like in 1830?
I'm talking about. Give me 1 second. I'm talking about 1626.
Wait, were they called constables or were they called police?
Local sheriffs.
Okay. Sure. Um, I I don't know how do I break it down? So again, a lot of these positions were extremely unofficial in the sense that we obviously recognize now we have a very obvious we have a very obvious laid out jurisdiction, right? So you have we have the county sheriff's office, right, and that's given by the state the power to the county to be able to police themselves with the sheriffs there. And so then that county sheriff's department is recognized and officially recognized by the state position. Those things back in 1690 were not. They were unofficial positions. They were not recognized by the state. They did not. They weren't provided their powers by the state. They were provided the power by local municipalities.
Wait. They were represented by the king's authority in the area. Those local municipalities, right, were under the jurisdiction of the king.
We didn't have a king. What are you talking about?
In 1626, before America was founded?
Yeah, what kings in 1626 in the United States? I'm talking about. Are you talking? Wait, are you talking about in Britain? Or are you talking about United States?
Wait, who was in control of the colonies?
I don't remember them being called kings. Were they?
You don't remember that the British Kingdom had kings?
I remember the British Kingdom had kings.
They were in charge of us. We were under their rule. Colonies were specifically under that rule.
Well, sure.
Or not. I don't even know if they were considered colonies at that point. To be more specific, they were always under that rule. They were authorized by the state to engage in that way because the state at that point, there weren't really states, quote unquote, back then, but the current understanding of our state did happen around that time. That's where the beginning of it was. They were authorized under under the power of the king and the parliament to engage in that way.
Sure. Okay. So this might be an area where I don't know about I don't know very much about United States prior to 1776. I don't that's it's just not an area that I'm particularly well versed in, honestly. So I don't know. So
sure.
But it would stand to reason to me, sure, that if during the time when the United States was basically an annexation of freaking the British Empire, during that time it would stand to reason that we would probably follow some of the same rules of the police at
Common
that
law.
point, right? They had police, and so I could understand how that would be police there, but that's an entirely different functioning system from the United States government. Because for the American people, from the time that America was founded, America never ever sanctioned the idea of having police. They were 100% against the idea of any policeman of any kind being armed, because they had the belief that
police and armed, those aren't mutual, those
so,
aren't the same thing.
So they
they
didn't want police in general. What they did allow, like I said, a constabulary, but there was a very big distinction between a constabulary and a police. They felt that any type of the people felt that they were able to govern themselves through armed militias, and that's typically what they used. They felt that the existence of an armed police of any kind, would suppress the will of the people, and they felt that it would rob them of their power, and they completely forbade any form of armed police whatsoever. So it wasn't an official police at all.
So you're specifically okay. So with the example that I brought up, you already ceded at that point. They kind of are real police in places like Albany, right?
Wait, if you're talking about before the establishment of the United States of America, sure, I will agree with you. But then, at that point, but we're talking about United States.
It does. Wait, the United, it's not the United States and everything that happened just exists after 1776. There's a history before it, right? And even before that, we existed with the common law, where we derive a lot of law from.
Sure,
but so
common law, but
but
then we have a constitution, and that was what made America very unique. In the fact that we established
where do you think the Constitution derives from?
Sure. So the Constitution derived from the will of the founding fathers, who believed that the
Magna Carta?
It was
the Magna Carta.
Democracy was a completely unique thing in 1776 that had never existed before, and it was literally the will of the founding fathers. And that did, and democracy did not derive from common law. Democracy was something that was completely unnew and unfounded.
I never made that specific claim. You talked about the
democracy
Constitution.
Is the birth of the United States of America.
Oh, well, okay. I never disagreed with that initial claim, but
okay,
I'm talking about.
So when we're talking about
let me finish.
Police,
Okay.
Okay, go ahead.
Talking about where things derive from. That's important
Sure.
because we derived a lot of our law from the common law, the same way that the Constitution found its basis in things like the Magna Carta, John Locke, and Hobbes. Right? It's important that we look at these groups when we look at the Constitution in that point in time. Right? That's one of the major inspirations for the Constitution. Right? If you want to talk about the governing system, that's a different thing. Right?
Sure, but the government, but the police are part of the governing system.
Whoa. Okay, let me finish. So one of the major actual issues that the U.S. government was having was the option of a centralized force. That was the major distinction, right? Mm-hmm. Centralization was something that was a major issue when it came to local governments establishing elected sheriffs. The federal government did not necessarily engage and make them disregard those, right? That's an important aspect. So when we have policemen like the ones in Albany, when we have common law that derives from that aspect, when we have sheriffs that still exist today, I think that's an important thing to look at, right? And this doesn't even necessarily address the point, and we can go further to whether they're inherently corrupt. But I don't think your point stands to a certain extent. If we want to go back to the definition, that's fine too, as to why that definition initially that I mentioned was valid. But the first police in America weren't slave patrols.
Wait a minute. What? Yeah. So I don't know. I guess we are kind of just going around in circles at this point. I don't know where to go from here.
In chat, our good friend Leia was posting a source on policing, talking about how police in this country had two different sources, right? One in the South being the slave patrols that you were talking about, and a different source in the North, right?
That's true.
So, can we say both are true, right? Both are true, and the South especially was influenced by these practices. They may have spread to other areas, right? But,
I completely agree with that.
Sure, I can agree with that. Yeah.
So but that's that point is can completely stand with the later point initially too. I think we'll get to that, but I was disagreeing with this aspect of that's where police derived from. We're from slave patrols, completely in the U.S. Okay. I do believe that slave patrols made a massive effect, and that's where a lot of local departments, for example, in the South arise from, because they were very different places inherently, right?
Sure.
Back then they were looked at as
So wait. This is where you're wrong then, okay? So if we wanted to start talking about the South specifically, because the South specifically is where the slaves were, in the South specifically, and I guess I probably should have thought about that. We were literally arguing South versus North. In the South specifically, police were the very first police then were slave patrols, and then those slave patrols evolved into those slave patrols evolved into policemen immediately after the Civil War during the Reconstruction era.
So specifically, right, the point that you made was talking about, this is where they get a lot from, this is where places like Boston and Philadelphia and New York derived their police systems from. And I was disagreeing with that, right? You said we were talking about the first policeman in America, right? The point that I made isn't necessarily I can present the point that I just made and also talk about how northern and southern police systems were completely different. That doesn't necessarily go against my point at all, and the point that I'll make up later.
Sure. So okay. So they are two different. They're two different functioning systems. One from the north and one from the south. And so then you're willing to concede for sure that when it came to the South, that all policemen at that point were 100% used and derived directly from slave patrols, right?
Most likely most of them, but I'm not conceding anything. I never disagreed with that point.
Okay, great. So then you agree with the idea then. Fine. So then my initial point was that in the South specifically, police were slave patrols, and then immediately...
You didn't make that initial claim, though.
I absolutely did. I literally read through it. Okay, I'm sorry. You're right. As I said before, I'm sorry if you want to hold me to that. My mistake for not making a distinction between the North and the South. That was my mistake. But what I was talking about specifically was the South, because there weren't slaves in the North. So I guess it kind of should have been implied, but I guess it's my fault for not making it a very verbal distinction. Yeah,
sure. So this is an important descriptive claim that we've made. So I think it may be time to get into the initial question, right? Sure. Are police inherently corrupt?
Sure.
So I have a question for you. Do you think there could ever be a time in American history in the future where the police were not corrupt? They just proceed not to be corrupt?
Um, in order for us to get to a place where police are not corrupt, it would require a reimagining of the entire system of policing such that it would be hard to identify what the new system would be with the previous mode of policing.
So even by your
if we
definition,
want non-corrupt police, they would not be police anymore. They would. It would be in
So
such a
even
different
if-
functioning system.
so with the definition that you gave, would they be recognized by the federal government?
Would they be? Would the new
Yeah,
existing
yeah,
body be recognized by
yeah,
the government? Sure.
yeah. Would they have the ability to carry out laws with coercive force?
If this new body that's no longer the police that we know and understand today, sure.
You just described a police force.
I did not. You see, because you have to understand inherently when we have a police force and within the United States, they've existed. The reason they were created was with a specific intent in mind. Again, you're appealing to a broad sociological definition when we have a legal one given by the government, and we have
What's the legal definition by the government? You keep saying that, but you haven't provided it.
Sure, let me find it. Here it is.
Because I can also go into sure. So do you think that like military police are police as well?
Hold on. I'm trying to find a legal definition, so we don't keep running around that.
Take a moment. Go ahead. Take your time.
Yeah.
Do you want to say anything right while we're waiting, Polar? Or?
Yeah, so I think Fanatiq keeps appealing to this definition, this legal definition of police, but I think he's going to have a hard time finding it because it's a very even in America, right? Even when we consider in America, what we consider the police is very abstract. That's one of the reasons why this policing definition that I initially gave was specifically is abstract. That's one of the largest things that sociologists have to deal with, right? Because a lot of times police will deal with things that aren't necessarily directly law enforcement, right? So at that point, well, then how do you know what a policeman is? Okay. That's why it's a general and broad definition.
Perfect.
Because of the variety of which quote unquote police force actually does.
So here's a very obvious definition. When it comes to the federal government, at the federal level, there exists both federal police who possess full federal authority as given to them under United States Code. That's what I was talking about, legal definition there. When it comes to state polices, then most state operate statewide government agencies that provide law enforcement rules, including investigations and state patrols. They may be called state police or highway patrol and are normally part of the State Department of Public Safety. So typically, this is why I keep saying, and yes, you're right, it would be hard to pinpoint it because, of course, we have in the United States, we have 50 different states, and all of them have different rules and whatever. And the federal police is going to be defined through a very broad system that's going to apply just to the federal government. But when you want to start talking about state police, which is what we typically interact with, those are going to be provided by the state, and it's going to be based on the powers given in each individual state's constitution and state codes. So then, yes, in each individual state, we're going to have that. But a police, and no matter what, in all of these cases, will be a codified, recognized governmental party that is used to enforce laws that are very clearly codified within the state's code. Every time.
State's code or federal code?
State code for state police, federal code for federal police.
Sure. So even with the example that you gave, if we had a society where they were recognized by the federal government, they were codified by the state and allowed to use coercive forces to impose the laws that the state has set, that would be considered a policeman. It would still be police.
Sure. But
then the police then the example that you just gave, you just answered the question in and of itself. The police,
what question?
We brought up an example where they weren't corrupt, they were still recognized by the federal government, they were still codified by the federal government, but they weren't. You thought it'd be possible.
Sure.
Right?
But again, I answered yes, it would be possible if they were reimagined in such a way that they no longer represented anything remotely close to what we understand policing to be now, such that it would be hard to even call them police.
You keep shifting your definition,
I'm not shifting the definition.
Because your definition of a policeman, as mentioned earlier, was that they had to be codified and at least recognized by the federal government and have the ability to use coercive forces to actually enact laws.
Sure.
Right? So it wouldn't matter if we the way that we know them now, like the black suits, the cars, if they still fit that definition, they're still police by your definition.
Dude, you're literally begging the question.
How am I begging the question?
It's really simple, because basically what you're doing is, okay, given that we already assume X, Y, and Z, then can we have A? If we assume X, Y, and Z. And my argument from the beginning is that we will never have X, Y, and Z.
You just said that it was possible, though, earlier.
No, I'm
You just said it
not.
was possible for a force in the future to do that.
Sure, if
You
we beg the
just said
question.
that.
If we beg the question. Because
No,
again,
but you agreed and engaged with that. I
I
asked if it
didn't
was
because
possible.
I answered
You
with
think it's possible?
I answered with a caveat of X, Y, and Z. I specifically said if. So here's where I'm not begging the question here,
Okay.
right? I said if they were reimagined such that they no longer resembled the country, resembled what we know as policemen in any capacity right now, and then they were still able to be functioning and recognized by the government in that situation, then they could be not corrupt.
So
But if
I
that
asked
would
you-
require an entirely different body
Why-
that would
wait,
be
wait.
so distinguishable that we would not even be able to recognize it as a police force. That's what I said. I'm sorry,
Okay,
that would
so
not be
specifically,
recognizable
then I'll
as our
ask you.
current police
Then I'll
force.
okay. So then I'll ask you, right? Why do you set that arbitrary standard?
Because we obviously have.
Why do we have to think of them as, like, you mentioned that we would, like, one, that, like, they have to be completely different than the way that we understand police now. But the example that you gave of how we understand police is broad enough to fit that general definition. So why do you set that arbitrary standard?
Well, because we obviously recognize that from their inception, what their intention and how the government uses them creates that corruption. For example, if you have a police force,
doesn't mean
let
anything.
me. I will. I'm gonna explain it. So we have a police force whose whole job is specifically to oppress African Americans through, like, the war on drugs through Nixon. At that point, then yeah, that entire body, that entire force is going to be corrupt because the entire thing that they're there to enforce is going to be corrupt.
You're making a lot of logic jumps right now.
Okay, which
Because
one?
so you just mentioned, okay, so we have a definition of police, but
Sure.
then you just said that it's inherent for the police to they oppress black people and such as, and that's what the police are right now. But that doesn't mean that the police have to be in the future.
So no, that's
right?
what that's
And
what,
whether
that's
the
what
example
they
that you
always
just gave
have
was
been.
possible.
That's what they always have been.
It
That's
doesn't
what they
matter
continue-
what they.
That's what they are.
But that's not true with the example that I gave with the direct, like, where the police are actually coming from. As I mentioned,
Since
northern
the United
police
States has
may not have
been,
been.
since the United States has been founded, they have always been.
They've always been what?
They've always been corrupt.
So specific. So wait. Just because something always has doesn't mean that it's inherent in the future that it must.
Well,
That's an important point.
I can
Because
agree
by
with
the
that.
definition of what you said.
No,
yeah.
but
So
no,
by the definition that you
but
just. Let me finish. Stop.
Okay,
Stop. Okay.
Hold on, go ahead.
So you keep shifting points, right? When I ask you a specific question, right? So I'm asking you, do you want to expand on your definition of what police is? Right? Because with the example that you gave, even if they're so radically different, even if, like, it's a different governing body, but it's still recognized by the federal government, we don't even look at them as police anymore in the sense of, like, that's how we perceive them. If they still fit that, like, when I mean see them, I mean, like, aesthetically different, when it means, like, their public perception. But if they still meet that standard that we set before as to what a policeman is, why would they not be police?
Because so since police have been since the creation of police, they've had a specific character, right? They've had a thing that we would call the essential character of what policeman is, right? The thing which would be defined by the intent of their creation, and then would be also defined by the actions that they've carried out and the way they've enforced the way they've enforced the law since they've been created, right? That's how you would define their character. So then if we're going to change that character to something else, then at that point it would no longer be the same body.
And expand on your definition then.
So let me try this. Try to help this conversation out because it seems like you're stuck here, right?
Sure.
Okay. So Fanatiq, are you, when you say the police are corrupt, are you just saying that, like, American police are corrupt?
Sure.
Or, like, a career of policing is corrupt, right?
Specifically,
so, like, if
the United States.
India. Okay.
So
I
don't study
India,
other countries. I just care about mine.
Okay. Fair enough. But, like, okay, you don't say other countries, but, like, you can imagine a country like England, right? Not too far from us, right? Canada, right? Like, culturally not also different. Australia, right? Like these countries you can at least imagine, even though you haven't studied them, right?
Mm-hmm.
But in those cultural contexts, as best you understand them, do you think they would be corrupt in the same way or a similar way, like in use to against minorities? Is that, like, your sole definition of corruption?
It's not
that they're being state used.
Yeah, it's not just okay. So the problem with policing in general is not specifically that they're being used against minorities. It's that that the police are typically used to the police are used by the powerful to subjugate to subjugate their constituents, right? And so you want to talk about like early policing in like Boston, like, and they were specifically used. They were literally bought and paid for by like rich and powerful individuals to make sure that they suppressed any sort of unionization and to suppress strikes. That was the entire whatever. So at that point, yes, it was very corrupt because they were like their whole goal and their entire point was always to suppress like working people, like to suppress the people who didn't have power. That's literally, they've always just been tools for the powerful. That's what police always are. Unless we have some sort of self-governing body that ends up, unless policemen are from a community and therefore have goals that are similar to what the community that they're policing, then they will always inherently be corrupt. Because otherwise I have to appeal to the idea that there's going to be people, but we've always heard the phrase like absolute power corrupts absolutely. Like we're always going to have a group of people work in their best interest, and when you give someone that amount of power, and they don't have the motivation that says I better do right by these people because these are my people, I don't ever expect police to ever not be corrupt. I can't imagine a world in which they would not be, and we can't imagine a history in which they have not been, because they never have ever. They, in literally over hundreds of years, they've never not been.
Okay, Fanatiq. So with the definition that you just described, you're focusing a lot on the descriptive reality, right, of what they once were, right? And I think that's important, right? But like, can you restate now your definition of them? Are they required to engage in like corrupt behavior for them to be considered police?
No, I don't think they're required to engage in order for them to be considered police. I would say that they're going to engage in corrupt behavior in the United States. Sure, like the way that's what
Okay.
they always have done.
Do you believe that police over the past 150 years have become less or more corrupt?
I don't think that. I would say probably there's been no change.
You really think there's been no change in the corruption of the police?
Can you show
Do you
me?
honestly say that?
Can you?
Yes. For
Okay,
example, in
great.
places
Show
like
me that.
so sure. So in places like New York, in places like Boston, there were these things called bosses, right? So what specifically happened is you had major cases of not just like minor bribery, but where police services were completely bought off by bosses, political bosses, to then manipulate immigrants into voting and intimidating specific individuals into voting, right? This is one of the major issues when it came to like American democracy.
You said that was in New
major
York?
cities. Yeah, it wasn't just in places like New York, but New York, Boston. I'm pretty sure Philadelphia. They're called boss systems, where there'd be individuals who are powerful in a political scale, bosses that would specifically buy out policemen to then go and make sure that people vote, have them in their back pockets, right? And we don't even have bosses now as much. So I would specifically say, no, we're not as corrupt, right?
Great. Okay, wait, hold on. Let me just stop you right there. Let's just read this really quick. New York Attorney General sues NYPD to install monitor alleges years of civil rights abuse. New York Attorney General Letitia James said the landmark lawsuit outlined years of excessive force and false arrests, most recently during racial justice protests last year. I don't know what you're talking about, like some corruption disappeared. The corruption is still there. It might change. Hold on. Okay, great.
Wait a minute. You gotta stop strawmanning.
I'm not strawmanning. Hold on. I'm not strawmanning. So then if the corruption... Wait, hold on. If the corruption existed, didn't subside, and still exists, then there hasn't been a change in the corruption.
Wait, all I said
so
was,
it did exist, it didn't subside, and there hasn't been a change.
Can you let me speak, please? Okay? All I'm asking is whether the police, do you believe, have they gotten more corrupt or less corrupt? Or do you think all corruption is the same?
How do you quantify the difference between the two different styles of corruption?
Okay, so I have an example, right? Do you think having a system where where specific political bosses have the ability to buy off complete police forces and intimidate people into voting, I think we would both agree that's pretty corrupt.
Sure.
But if you therefore have another system where a policeman, someone tips off a policeman to give them off a speeding ticket, right? That seems pretty corrupt to me. Are they both the same levels of corruption?
I mean, again, I don't know how you would be quantifying the differences in these corruptions.
You really think that they're...
Let me answer your question really simply. If, as a policeman, you are required to follow a specific set of codes and you are violating those codes, then you are by definition corrupt. and pointing out to different styles and different kinds of corruption. For example, a person that jaywalks is just as much of a criminal as a person who assaults someone, who is just as much of a criminal as a person
Corrupt
who
as an
rapes someone.
adjective.
Right.
Criminal's a
Right. And so
noun.
then they would
Criminal's a
both be
noun.
corrupt. They would both be corrupt.
I'm using an adjective. No, so I'm not. It's not the fact. So sure, right? Like murder and murder and jaywalking are both crimes. But do you really think that do you think one is worse than the other?
One is not more illegal than the other. No, not legally. No.
I'm asking you.
But you're asking me to put a value judgment on something, that's codified by the law. So
if you're going to specifically tell me, right, if we want to get back to the initial example, right, even the law does this actually. They have longer sentences, like more restrictive actions for each one of those.
Sure.
So even the law designates like which one they would see as worse, right? Or which one as they see as like more criminal, quote unquote, right? So specifically when it comes to corruption, right? Do you really think the two examples that I gave you can't quantify and say which one is worse? I'm not even asking you to put a number value on it, right? I'm just asking you, which one do you think is more corrupt?
I feel like what you're doing is you're asking me to do something really arbitrary, which I typically avoid doing. And here's why. We have a system already in play, and I'm gonna subscribe to that system. So the only way that I'm gonna draw a distinction between these two is going to be there's like a felony and there's a misdemeanor. You have a felony and a misdemeanor. Those are the two very big broad distinctions that we make. Now we do have a group within there, and we've decided as a society that we'll have different sentences based on those things. That's what I'm going to subscribe to. Asking me to place my own arbitrary value judgments between two different things that are both felonies or both misdemeanors, I'm not going to do that. We have a reasoning for that. Now, like, so you're going to ask me, do you think murder is worse than rape? And it's like, to be honest with you, I don't know which one would be worse. But they're both felonies, thankfully.
But obviously, that's difficult to do, right? Of
course.
But I would say, that's difficult to do. But with the example that I gave, those are drastically different situations. How do you think we measure corruption?
I mean, we have, it's pretty arbitrary, to be honest with you, but we obviously, as a society, we come together and then make a determination for how these things should be.
So corruption is actually based on the way that they measure it is based on perception, right? And which one do you perceive? I'm asking you to be more corrupt.
I don't have a personal opinion on these things. I subscribe to whatever the law is.
You really can't tell which one is more corrupt? You're really going to say that?
I subscribe to our laws. That's what I'm going to subscribe to.
Wait,
you're asking me to do something arbitrary, which I typically avoid.
Stop. So specifically, actually the law probably does. Like if you were to do this now, right? If I gave you two examples, I can almost tell you that massive bribery and intimidation by the police probably carries a longer sentence than like paying off like a policeman to engage in bribery. So even by the standard that you set, by even looking at it legally, there's still a difference.
I guess if you could show me that, but yeah. Oh, at the end of the day, look, I'm not going to arbitrarily decide something for you and get like that. That's just not how I do.
Okay, so arbitrarily. Okay, what do you mean by arbitrary? I'm curious.
Something that's not really hard line and defined. Like I'm not going to make my own loosely defined decision about whether or not of a value judgment on something. I'm not going to do that.
Do you think the definition of corruption? Would you like me to give you the definition of corruption so that you can make a statement?
I already did make the statement. I said if you are violating the laws and precepts given to you by the government, you are by definition corrupt.
Okay, and so I gave you both of those examples, right?
Mm-hmm. So
and we put them in a current situation.
So they're both equal. So they're both corrupt.
They're both equal?
Sure. So okay.
So wait. No, I'm not asking. Wait. Stop. So I have to clarify. Okay, I'm not asking which one. They're both corrupt, but which one do you think is more corrupt?
How do you quantify them?
So the government quantifies this by placing certain terms, in the sense of terms of jail time, whether it's fines, whether it's restrictions. The government does this. They quantify it.
So then, however the government quantifies it, then that's how I would say. I don't think that the government makes a very clear distinction between someone being hired by a mob boss and someone What was the other?
Yes.
What was the
Wait.
other example? I'm sorry. Yeah, the government clearly doesn't make a distinction because both of them.
Wait. Mass
Yeah.
bribery,
Yeah.
intimidation by the police. There is a
Sure,
distinction.
or violating
Most
people's
definitely.
civil, or violating an entire
No
group of people's
distinction
civil
in the
rights.
terms and like terms, lengths, and services that they give them. Actually, even when it comes to length and like it's like length of like terms that they'll give for corruption, it's up to a judge. So a judge, actually, an individual who's been trained to that aspect, has been able to make like a. But they still make a decision on that. You asked how a government does that.
I'm not a
judge.
No, I'm not a judge. So the judge is going to arbitrarily. The judge gets to make the distinction between between sentencing, but the unless something has a mandatory minimum sentence, even then there's obviously discretion. But I hope to God that you're not asking me as a layperson to apply discretion, just like which is why I'm calling it arbitrary. I hope you're not asking me as a layperson who hasn't studied these things to apply my own discretion and create a value judgment that's going to be consistent on the differences in corruption. The thing that I will say is that they are both legally corrupt.
How do you make any moral judgment? How do you make any moral judgment?
Typically, I use the Bible.
Do you think the Bible makes it? Actually, I don't want to push you on that one. That'll be a fun one.
Yeah, they do. Yes,
for that
they make a
okay?
difference between abominations.
Now it kind of makes sense as to why you see these things as kind of equal. Not gonna lie.
Okay. Well, sure, because that's a biblical principle, right? Hold on, really quick. If I can address that really quickly. So there's a biblical principle, really simple, where it says basically you've done one sin, you've done them all, right? Like that they are equal. So the person who lies to his wife is the same person who cheats on his wife. Is the same person who beats his wife. And like these things are all equivalent. It's what's wrong is wrong. Corruption is corruption.
So if we so how do you think? So if a judge makes this decision arbitrarily, right? Mm-hmm. That thing still happens. That judgment is still set there, and distinction is still made.
Sure.
Right.
Mm-hmm.
So you said that you could never make the distinction between two forms of corruption because it's arbitrary, right?
Yeah.
How would we have a functioning society if we couldn't make the distinction, right?
No, I said I would not.
But so then
so okay. No. Let me answer really quickly. So this is a problem that I've always had with our judicial system. That's literally the biggest problem when it comes to African Americans and the disparate sentencing. It all comes down to prosecutorial discretion. I've long argued, like for God knows how long, that we it should not be discretionary. It should not be arbitrary because we recognize anytime that we have we have prosecutorial discretion, that it ends up resulting in very, very different sentences for Black people than the other. And that's a problem. It shouldn't be arbitrary. We should have it written down, and it should be able to be calculated by a computer so that we can make sure these things are consistent. I don't know why we would sit there and say, yes, Brock Turner, you can get 6 months for raping somebody, and we'll...
The reason I did that is because you set your standard initially by talking about the legal aspects of it. Like, there's still crimes.
Yeah, there's still crimes.
Right? And that was the standard that you set. But how do you determine what a crime is? It's arbitrary.
By our law. By the laws. No.
Wait, how do you determine laws?
So the laws have already been long determined. They're literally written down in code. And whatever those things are, legally...
How do you come to that law, though?
How does who come to that law? How do I?
How do the lawmakers?
So the law
that's arbitrary too.
Sure,
they agree on a specific case, right? So like,
no. What you're doing is really ridiculous. What you're doing is basically saying you're making the argument that nothing can be arbitrary about the situation, and that's not what I'm saying. I'm saying I as a layperson am not going to play this game of arbitrarily placing value judgments. I, as an individual, we as a society, clearly arbitrarily place specific laws. They are written down, codified, and finite. And if they decide to be changed, then they can do so. But right now, as it stands, 2021, we have laws that are written down, and until they are changed, they are set in stone. And that's what we subscribe to as a society.
Okay, so I have a question for you, Fanatiq. So you said that like it's going to be very hard to make value judgments such as, and maybe I understand that. So I give you a hypothetical. Let's say that you're walking down the street, right? And to your left and to your right, there are two crimes going on, right? On one hand, there's a man that is about to stab a woman, right? And kill her, right? And then on the other hand, you have a person who's jaywalking, right? Oh, actually not that, but you have a person that's, for example, they're tripping a kid. Right? They're tripping a kid. And you have the ability to stop one of them. Which one are you going to stop?
I'd obviously stop the person who was...
You're making a value judgment right there.
I am.
You just made a value judgment.
For sure.
So specifically, and even though it was arbitrary, right? So even if it's arbitrary...
Hold on. Let me ask you a question. Which one of those things would be illegal?
You set your wait. Do you
I'm
do you
asking
determine
you,
morality by law?
which one of those things would be illegal?
But like, wait, if it comes with like harassing people,
Yeah,
harassing people is illegal.
no,
Yeah,
the thing you said,
they're
yeah,
both illegal.
they're both illegal,
Yeah,
right?
they're both illegal.
So then, for
Yeah, but you made it.
so hold on. So if both people were
Okay.
seen, then we would say that they're both criminals, right?
Sure.
Okay, so then there's no distinction.
So, but I'm asking you. I asked you if you could stop one of them. Which one are you going to stop? If you only have the ability to stop one.
Sure, I'm gonna stop.
Which one are you
I'm
gonna
gonna
stop?
make a choice to stop the one that's
Which
gonna
one?
not result. That's gonna result in less permanent harm. However,
You just
it
said a
didn't change.
value
But
judgment.
of course, but it doesn't change the fact that legally they are both criminal. Hold on. What at the end of the day, what you're trying to do is you're trying to say that there's less corruption, which you can't quantify. You cannot. The fact that we have the New York Attorney General in 2021 still suing people for the same sort of corruption that's existed for over 100 years, then at that point, the idea that we're going to say, well, there's less corruption, I need you to define it for me. How can you say there is less?
Less corruption in the sense of the extent at which it goes at.
So,
right. So if I took
how do you quantify that? How do you quantify how much? How do you quantify it? You can't even you can't quantify the first portion.
Come on. Let him go. Let him actually try. Go ahead.
So with the initial standard that you sent, like these things are arbitrary, right? Like and we make a value judgment, right? So you made a value judgment essentially on the aspect of, well, corruption, for example, can be defined as like misusing power, for example, and that can be a bad thing, right? Sure. So, for example, that may be higher cases of corruption. If the government, which is legal, sets a standard that one form of corruption is higher than another, they make a value judgment. Do you disagree with that value judgment? Yes or no?
I'm sorry, you got to repeat it one more time.
So, if the government makes a value and legislative they make a value judgment and determine that one form of corruption is more than the other, like it carries a bigger sentence.
Sure. Then I'm gonna subscribe to whatever the government said there.
So that may be a way to quantify how bad corruption is, right? By the type of corruption that they said, because corruption is broad, right? Sure. So, for example, with the corruption that I just set out, that toll, if we went right now in comparison to the other form, would be much higher. And to quantify it, you'd get longer sentences, may involve more people, and carries a higher penance and regulation. So that'd be one way to quantify it.
You can't quantify that because this lawsuit hasn't happened yet. We don't know the extent of exactly what the
that's not what I'm saying. Wait, stop. I'm not saying. I didn't say there was a specific lawsuit. I'm looking at the laws that we have currently, and if I propose a hypothetical, right? So one, I've established that these bosses did exist in the past, right?
Sure.
Okay. Another form of corruption, and that's important, right? So you set a standard by looking at laws, and they can be able to, and as I mentioned, you can quantify, the law will quantify certain crimes, right? So what I'm saying is if we take the corruption of the past and put it in our current system, the same way that we've legislatively made value judgments, it seems like if we took that same form of boss system and form of police corruption, put it in a city like Atlanta, the penances are much higher even on the books, right? In comparison to a policeman taking a bribe for for example, from someone who's trying to get out of a speeding ticket.
That wasn't the comparison that I made. So the comparison that I made,
I'm not going at the comparison that you specifically made. I'm just demonstrating. You asked me how I can quantify it, and I said, hey, we make it a value judgment. We quantify it. You said, okay, I agree with that, right?
Dude, you're literally you're arguing around in circles. So it's really, really simple. You said that there has been a that somehow the corruption has subsided. I'm saying absolutely it did not. The way that you defined that it has subsided was you talked about specific instances that happened, and you said that those specific things aren't happening anymore. I then levied an entirely new case of corruption that is resulting in the New York Attorney General suing them, and you're trying to say that this form of corruption is less than the previous form of corruption, which again, I don't know how you quantify either one of these things.
The government already does it, and you agree that that's a way of quantifying. So
show me show me the quantification from the government. What's the differences?
Okay, sure, I'll bring up the corruption cases, right? Give me 1 second.
You're going to have a hard time deciding how the government's quantifying the current one because it's still an ongoing case. So you won't have numbers.
I'm not talking about the specific case that you brought up.
What we're doing is I'm talking about quantify comparatively. The one that you mentioned and the one that I'm mentioning. You can't quantify the two. You cannot compare the two.
Wait, oh my god! Wait, they are okay. So Prime, you want to say something? Sure.
Yeah. So I mean, are we? And maybe I've missed this part, but are we quantifying simply based on the punishment, right? Saying that for committing these crimes, right? These corruption crimes.
Sure.
You'll be going to jail longer, right? Is that the sentencing the sentencing guidelines is what we're looking at. Okay.
Yeah, sure, because he was talking about how he can't really make a value judgment, but like the government can, right? That's just an example of an institution that can.
Okay.
So for example, so let me bring up like major bribery, and I think in a place like, yeah, you're gonna have to give me 1 second.
Yeah, sure, that's fine.
So yeah, I'll just make my point while he does his research really quickly. It's really, really simple. My main point is he's saying that corruption has somewhat subsided and that things have changed and become less corrupt.
I didn't say it subsided.
So if it did subside, keep looking, please. So my main point is that he pointed out corruption, and I'm saying that there hasn't been a change. There hasn't been like some sort of like things haven't improved, and that we have just different forms of corruption. So maybe back in the day you had like large amounts of collusion with like Al Capone and stuff during like prohibition days. Okay, that's a form of corruption. People cooperating with the mob and doing all sorts of illicit crimes. Like that's a form of corruption. And so then to say, okay, well, they're not as corrupt now, but now what they're doing is they're just widespread, like almost the entire department, wholly violating people's civil rights. And it's like, well, sure, so it's not the same kind of corruption. I don't know how you quantify the two. Like if one person is just going to be out here directly violating people's constitutional rights, and then you got another person who is like going to be turning a blind eye to a nigga selling some liquor. Like, I don't know how you would quantify those two. To me, it's arbitrary as hell, but at the end of the day, I would say that I don't see that as a difference in corruption. I don't see them, in fact, I don't know. I wouldn't probably say violating someone's civil rights is more. I'm just saying that they're both corrupt. And depending on how many people are still involved in this corruption, I would say that they're whatever. And I would argue that when it came to the mob bosses being hired off, that typically you only need a police chief, and then the police chief would probably be able to push whatever their agenda is to their subordinates. But when it comes to this civil rights violation, we're seeing this widespread across all of the data. We see multivariate data that proves that this is happening with the vast majority of interactions. So I would say that corruption is a lot more pervasive and therefore more problematic.
Okay, listen. You drastically misrepresented the argument that I presented. I wasn't talking about quote-unquote mob bosses, right? I was specifically referring to something called boss systems. Whereas policemen, individuals like bosses, would buy off all police, like a whole police station, buy off a chief, and then use individual officers to then go intimidate individuals of a local area, whether that meant making them pay rent for certain actions, bribing and making sure that people go vote. Who would do that
besides a mob person? That would be a mob. That would be a mob boss.
They're called political bosses. They were in office and then they leveraged it to do illegal actions.
Sure.
For example, they would use the policemen to then go extort like random citizens on the street to then go get them to vote for them and make sure that they vote and then extort them as a result, engaging with the whole police station. Okay. Right? And this is a consistent and concurrent focus. This is a major form of corruption. They would specifically target for example, they targeted black people worse back then than they did now. And I would hope that you wouldn't disagree with that, right?
Wait,
police did that?
What, did they
Do you think you think that the police right now and back then targeted black people just as much?
Yes.
That is very I would love to see you substantiate that, because that is an absolutely wild claim.
No, you're making a claim that there's a difference, and so then you would need to quantify the two to prove to me that there's
a difference. So you can easily prove that by specifically get the numbers.
Find me numbers.
Sure, that may be that may be harassment claims against African Americans. That may be unjust deaths that we can go through and look for.
That hasn't differed. I don't see a big difference there. Can you find me any numbers of that quantifiably?
Sure, we
Good,
can look
great.
at
Okay, this is really simple, really finite, right? Really simple. It's a really simple claim. You're claiming that harassment against blacks was significantly less now than it was at what time period was the thing that you're talking about? I'm just going to write this down so that
I just said less.
From what time to what time? What time to what time?
Oh, hey, chill. Okay, I'm pulling up the numbers right now.
Yeah.
Okay. Okay. Considered political machines. This ranged from. So this ranged from late 1800s to early 1900s. Okay. So if you want specific.
So you're saying from late 1800s to 2021.
So essentially Jim Crow era, is that what you're saying?
Including Jim Crow era, yeah.
Yeah.
I'd be surprised to hear that point, right?
So you're saying from 1800 to 2021 there was a decrease in harassment of African Americans?
When it comes to percentage of the population, they were less likely to be, most likely less likely to be harassed now than it was 100 years ago. Most definitely.
So that would be 1921. So from
No, well, like from the time period that I started out, so that'd be like late 1800s to where we are now. Yeah, I'd most definitely rather want to live as a black person now when it comes to facing the police than it did 120 years ago. Would you disagree with that?
well,
Or 140?
well, sure. If you're, I mean, hold on.
Fanatic, come on, man.
This is
come on, please.
No. You please, nigga. I started talking about the policing in the Reconstruction era, which was in 1877, and now you're talking about early 1800s. The frick are you talking about? And specifically, I mentioned that that they were literally corrected. I mean, they were literally made specifically to enforce slave codes. So if you want to talk about were they used specifically to enforce slave codes, was there a difference then till now? Like, come on, bro. Like, what the hell are you talking about? You've gotten so far down into your argument that you're literally trying to argue that from the 1800s to 2021 that there's a difference. That's how far you're going. The hell?
I'm so sorry, man.
You're ridiculous. You're ridiculous.
Okay. Okay.
I'm sorry, you got me. You won one. From 1821 to 2021, yeah, there's been a difference. The freak is this argument, bro? What?
Okay. Okay.
I'm sorry. I've been wrong this whole time. I guess you're right. There has been a change in corruption from 1821 to 2021. I'm sorry.
But
corruption.
Correct me if I'm wrong, right? Correct me if I'm wrong, Polar. But like, I thought you said the which you originally stated as the beginning of this period, specifically of political bosses, was around the late 1800s.
Yeah,
that's
true.
why I thought of Jim Crow. Because 1800s,
late 1800s. Yeah,
into early 1900s. So.
Yeah, so like that period on from now, that's how I mentioned from like late 18th century to early 19th century. This also coincided with like the boss system as well, the political machines.
Yeah.
So like I would say that like extorting citizens consistently, buying off complete police chiefs to win elections, like consistently harassing your citizens. I would say that's like the worst form of corruption than we have now, and the legal system quantifies that with like bribery and the charge for bribery in comparison to the way like currently like writing off a police like giving someone not a speeding ticket right now is like held to a much lower standard comparatively. I don't even know if there's specific legislation that deals with that.
Okay, let me ask you a question really quick, Polar. Would you say that if we had an entire police department that was like explicitly racist, right? Like that was explicitly racist and part of a white national organization or part of, some Aryan Brotherhood or whatever. They were just like explicitly racist. An entire department, or 85% of a department was explicitly racist and just wreaking havoc over an entire city. Would you say that was significantly less corrupt than the political bosses?
85%. In what forms of what were they actually doing? What do you mean specifically? Like I brought up specific examples.
They were like literally fabricating and planting evidence. They were like literally physically harassing and like beating people up. They were disproportionately only targeting or like massively disproportionately targeting blacks and like literally physically assaulting them. They were giving them longer sentences by registering them in gang databases. They were just literally wreaking havoc on an entire community. Would you say that that's significantly less corrupt than the thing that you're talking about?
Probably not, for the sake of that, like the bosses did almost the exact same thing with the extension of like manipulate. And wait, I said it wasn't. Okay. I said that they weren't. I can go into specifics as to why if you want to hear them.
Sure, like, break it down. What's the difference?
Sure. So I would say that the difference is that you would use, not only were you doing those things that you described, specifically targeting like minorities in the area and beating the shit out of them, but they also manipulated their power to win elections and make sure that other people wouldn't run. Therefore, they would like intimidate individuals, they would beat the shit out of them. The police did not act at all. And if you're referring to like New York, if you're gonna like if that it was that the example that like you were bringing up, or like no. Because that's what. Okay, so like maybe you were.
I don't know where we even go from here, man. This because this argument it's already done. Like because so for me, like the idea that the Rampart Division in Los Angeles, it was one of the most corrupt things. They had to shut down the entire department. We've also seen in Minneapolis where they literally shut down the entire department, and the Justice Department said that it was one of the most corrupt police stations in existence. So they had to literally just completely
in existence.
They literally ended the entire department and just shut it down and said, "Hey, from now on, y'all don't exist.
You're making a historian's fallacy.
We'll start depending on neighboring cities.
You're making a historian's
Sure.
fallacy.
So then at the end of the day, the idea that you're creating some distinction and saying, well, these people were more corrupt. Again, I don't know how we're going to quantify this. To me, when you have the Justice Department come down and shut down an entire department and they do their own investigation and find that the corruption is so rampant that their only alternative is to completely shut the department down, I don't know how you say that it's significantly less corrupt than the other one.
So you're making the historian's fallacy, right? In this sense, you're looking at if they were just as corrupt, the federal government would have shut them down. The federal government didn't care because they were just as corrupt, right? So you're bringing your current perspective and applying that to the time of the past, right? So for example, if I were to tell you that oh yeah, this group is there's these for example, let's say we're in a school, right? And the principal's coming hard down on these kids that are being racist. They're calling a student the N-word, yada, yada, yada. And you're like, it's so racist that this is specifically happening, right? And you're like, that's pretty bad. And you're trying to compare that to 100 years in that same school where for example, maybe white kids, maybe black kids weren't even allowed to come. And when they tried, they would beat the shit out of them and potentially kill them. But the principal didn't really recognize nor care. So what we're actually engaging with, and at this point, you're trying to say, well, look how racist this is, look how bad this is, and it's you're using the historian's fallacy by specifically looking at it from your perspective and the current perspective as the way that we see the issue now. But that's not the way that we looked at it in the past, because corruption in the past, those political machines, they were government leaders, right? So there was no incentive for them to do anything like that. As a result, they held federal representatives, state representatives, city representatives. So I don't even this quantification that you gave isn't applicable because we're not because the people who were actually engaging in the systems were completely different. So you bringing up the fact of the Minneapolis Police Department is so corrupt that they had to shut it down. Well, yeah, because the current police, our current standards, we probably want to go against corruption. That's kind of one of the goals of the federal government right now, is to generally, to a certain extent, go against corruption. That's not even something that they cared about in the past. It was okay.
All right, so
the standard you said is not it doesn't work.
Sure. So someone in my chat said something that I think is succinctly nails this whole thing. They basically said that the laws change and the police are just as corrupt because they are as corrupt as the current system allows them to be. So the corruption didn't change within the heart of the police station. The thing is that we now have governing bodies that are specifically there to manage the corruption within the police officers, and they are still just as corrupt as they always have been. It's just that now we have specific people investigating them, which is curtailing some of the things that they would do otherwise. But the corruption isn't different, and anything that they can still get away with, they're just doing. So the police stations themselves are not less corrupt. It's just thankfully we have other safeguards in place to manage it. For example, when Obama was in office, he literally created an entire Department of Justice task force specifically to start investigating police stations for doing specific things. It didn't change what police stations were doing. They were still doing it at the same rate. There was no change in rate. But what they did do is now it's at least we have people that are going to investigate them, and it's not them investigating themselves and exonerating themselves. But yeah, the corruption hasn't changed. I think I don't know. Yeah.
So even if with the example that you gave, so if they're not allowed to do it and they don't do it, I don't know if we measure corruption by intention, right? There's specific yes, you can intended, right? But you can be charged for an intended bribery, but you still have to be found of doing that, right? So specifically, even with the example that you gave, talking about the federal government, Obama, opening up parts of the federal, the Justice Department to actually handle that. The Justice Department did actually have effect on a few cities specifically.
Very little though, because they were very much hamstrung though. Wait, let me finish.
Whoa, okay, you have to let me finish. Okay. So with the example that you gave, it doesn't really matter if they really wanted to in their heads. If they're not actually doing it, or they don't actually set up intentions to, in the sense of intending to bribe people and then getting caught and not actually being able to go through it. This is a very bad and dumb hill to die on, honestly, to say that it's all the same currently because we have laws and they really want to but they can't, so they're just as corrupt, but we measure corruption on the basis of what they're actually doing with it, right? So that's a very odd arbitrary standard to set. Not necessarily arbitrary.
It's really simple. So here's an example. Okay, so you had Al Capone. Maybe he was super duper corrupt, right? And he did prohibition and all that. So I can't even make an example. Sure. So he was doing prohibition, right? And then he was also selling drugs. So he was literally bootlegging alcohol, and he was also selling drugs and involved in extortion and all these other things, right? So once the country legalizes alcohol production, right? So he stopped selling alcohol because there's no longer a market for it, but he's still maintaining everything else that he's been doing. You would say he's less corrupt because
Corruption on the basis of actions.
so
Yeah,
you would
wait,
say because
if he
so
stopped-
I'm asking. So are you saying so
Wait.
simply? So even if he's doing all 5 of these like super corrupting, extorting people, bribing politicians, like doing the doing the freaking alcohol production. So all that he's doing all like 5 really really corrupt things, and then all of a sudden one of his markets disappears because the government legalizes alcohol, but he's still maintaining the other 4 things. You would say he's less corrupt?
So okay, tell me. I'll answer your question, right? So like, let me just get the scenario right. Like with the as we define corruption, it's like unlawfully using your power to then like leverage certain specific situations, right? Would you agree with that?
Unlawfully using power to do illegal things.
Sure. Yeah. So for example, right, if Al Capone does 5 things: drugs, like he sells prostitutes, whatever. Let's just say 3 things for the sake of it. I don't know anymore.
Bootlegs.
Drugs, women, and bootleg alcohol, right?
Mhm.
If he stops engaging in one of those corrupt actions, by definition, he's less corrupt.
Oh my god! Yeah, so that's where we're running into a problem. Okay, so yeah, I got it. You made it as crystal clear. And this is where I 100% disagree with you. I would say that the corruption of an individual is defined by his intention and his character. That's what I would say defines the corruption of an individual is defined by his intention and his character. So because of the fact that maybe like there's certain restriction. Let's see.
But we're asking how we measure corruption, right?
Yeah. So like for example, a pedophile in a straitjacket is still very much a pedophile, right? And that doesn't change. A pedophile that's like literally restricted from ever being around children. Hold on, a pedophile that's restricted from ever being around children is still very much as much of a pedophile, and that like I would still judge that individual the same. Now we penalize people's actions, but if we're hold on, we penalize people's actions, but we judge their character based off of their intention. So if they have the same intention, if they still are as corrupt, if they're still as willing to violate the law, then at that point they are still corrupt. And so if we take away their need to violate a specific law, but they're still willing to violate the law, they are just as corrupt.
Can I
law doesn't
question there?
Yeah.
So if I like despise you, right?
Mm-hmm.
I don't. But if I despised you and I wanted you dead, right? But I took no action to kill you, right? Would that make me as much of a killer as if I actually did take action to kill you?
If you just wanted me dead, but you weren't going to kill me, no. Then
but I didn't take actions. Yeah,
sure. So here's the difference between these 2 things. Now is again just wanting something, but recognizing that you can't do it because it's wrong to do. That would not be corrupt.
It's not that I think it's wrong to do. It's just that, for instance, maybe I'm afraid of the consequences.
Sure.
Or maybe I don't have the resources. Right. Let's say the only way I can think of killing you is like through a hitman. Right. Like that's the only way I think to get it done. Right. In one universe, I have the money. In another universe, I don't have the money, but I want you just as much dead in both universes. So are both of those versions of me the same, right? In terms of their homicidal desires?
Sure, I would say that both of those individuals are just as evil. Sure. If the only thing preventing you from doing something is your limited means, then yeah, you are the exact same. Of course.
Okay. I'm asking that. Go ahead.
Yeah. Okay. So limiting someone's means and then them doing everything else still, it's like, yeah, no, you didn't change. You're still the same individual.
So I won't necessarily disagree that with the example that you proposed with Al Capone. Okay, they're both corrupt, but I think one of them is less corrupt because they're engaging in less corrupt actions afterwards. Right. So like, that's the way that the law looks at it. Right. Like it's not just an arbitrary like, oh, you did one crime, therefore like you did one crime and this other person did four crimes, right? They still quantify that and look at it differently. I'm actually curious, like on the bit, like this is more of a moral question. You looked at things through like intention, right? Like, so you're pretty like, you're not very consequentialist, right? You don't look at necessarily the harm of those actions. You tend to look at the intent.
I think it'd be autistic to wholly subscribe to only one of those. I think there's reasons for both.
You have to be consistent though, that when it comes to moral beliefs.
No, so yeah, you can be consistent within moral beliefs, but you have to recognize that moral beliefs are gonna, intention does matter just as much as consequences. You can be a utilitarian and a
Wait,
deontologist. Those two are not mutually
you
exclusive.
wait. You by definition, okay. You can. Okay, listen. Utilitarians can look at intent in the sense of like looking at like the action in and of itself, like that the actual action of doing it. So would you believe? So to clarify, do you think the action is like how we like do we look at the action or the effect of that action?
I think it depends on the situation, but I think there's both. Again, I'm a I think there are situations for utilitarian reasoning, and then there's situations for deontological reasoning. I think both of them
Okay,
apply.
so I'm gonna give you a little bit of credence here. Okay, you subscribe to divine command theory, like so you believe in God. So you really wouldn't subscribe to either of those. But you can't be a you can't be a deontologist and a utilitarian at the same time consistently. Like they're both like
Sure, of course
contrary.
not. I agree that they are not consistent, but
Sure.
I don't think they should be applying to everything. Just like it's like how we are in this country, right? Where we recognize we're a capitalist society, but we also believe in very strong sociological principles, such as
That's not the point that I'm making.
The point that I'm making. This is the point that I'm making. Is that yes, you can have a capitalist society while still having very strong sociological principles. Like for example, we believe in it's like we believe in
Yep.
like obviously like taking care of the poor. That doesn't mean that you have to abolish capitalism in order to do so. Like you can have both.
This is okay. I have to. We really should not get into this conversation, okay? Because
Okay, sure.
I don't think because of so you're talking about the descriptive, I'm talking about the prescriptive and what we ought to do. We ought to stay consistent with our moral positions because if we aren't consistent with our moral positions, they're not our moral positions. And so specifically how this goes back to what we were talking about, right? So we're specifically referring to like corruption, Al Capone, and whether these individuals are like actually corrupt or not, right? Not corrupt, but I agree with you. Al Capone is corrupt either way. But what I'm saying is like, do you think the amount of corrupt actions will determine whether an individual, whether individuals more or less corrupt?
Sure. So no. So no, I do not think that, and I would agree with you. The amount of corrupt actions that Al Capone would do once we eliminate one, it disappears. That doesn't change the fact that he's still the same corrupt individual that will do
Wait,
whatever the freak it takes in order to get whatever he wants, in order to pursue his
Okay,
means.
I have a question. So if person A commits one corrupt action,
Okay.
okay, and then person B commits 5 corrupt actions,
Mm-hmm.
okay, which one of those people is more corrupt? They're all this like yeah.
I would say that they're both equally corrupt, but I would say that one did more corrupt actions. Because corruption is willingness. Corruption is willingness to deviate. Because corruption is it is. Corruption is willingness to deviate from whatever the laws and restrictions
willingness.
are. Yes,
it's not willingness. It's actually doing it. Right. So what do you mean willingness? Right. When they actually refer to willingness, they actually mean like putting intent into it. So like intending to bribe and not actually being able to do that. Right. So in the sense of like, oh, wait, let me finish. I was going to try to bribe this specific individual, but the police caught me. That's what they mean by like intended bribery. But okay, let's say in their minds they really wanted to do it, but they never leveraged that power. Would you say that?
Or depending on the reasons, if they never did it, wait. So they really wanted to do something evil, but they were willing to abide by the law. Do you understand? Like, but now you created a situation where it's like, what about a guy who won't do this because it's against the law, but he'll do this other thing because it's against the law? Do you get why these two things are so inconsistent?
Okay, let's go back to this initial definition of police corruption.
Sure.
Police corruption is a form of police misconduct in which law enforcement officers end up breaking their political contract, that means with the contract with the state in the sense of protecting its citizens, and abuse their power for personal gain, right? You have Station A, okay, that like, oh, there's some of their officers, they're like, man, if the law wasn't here, crap, you know what I mean? Like, maybe I would engage in corruption, maybe I wouldn't, I don't really know. Then, police station B, they're engaging in all this corrupt action, intent-wise, in the sense of like they're trying and they're actually doing it. Which one of those stations is more corrupt? Or are they just as equally corrupt?
I would say they're both equally corrupt. Let me ask you a question really quickly. Hold on.
Go on.
Al Capone, same situation. He was doing all 5 of those things. He was doing all 5 of those things. You would say that he's corrupt. He's morally degenerate and perverted, right? Once the state legalizes alcohol, and he's still doing 4 of those other things, which include rape, prostitution, extortion, so on and so forth. The other 4 things. Would you say he is still morally degenerate and perverted?
Sure, but I can
So
say
then,
that
by
one of them is probably
definition,
more than
so
others.
so then by
One is
definition,
more
he's
than
still
the other.
corrupt.
Yes, they're still corrupt,
Okay.
right? In these specific situations, all I'm showing is that one is more corrupt than the other, Fanatic. That's
Yeah.
all I'm trying to demonstrate.
So
Right?
this argument is just going around in a circle because, as I stated from the very beginning, and I'm probably immutable in this position, I think that the corruption is going to be based off of the individual. It's a principle, right? The principle is being willing to violate the law in order to pursue your means. That is what corrupt means. That's what a person is. They are morally degenerate, right? And so if a person is morally degenerate, he's going to pursue his means and he's not going to consider the law in doing so. And as demonstrated in this Al Capone situation, he was willing to do it in the first 5. He was willing to do it in the next 4. It's just he had no reason to do that. So would you quantify and say, well, he's less corrupt now because he's doing one less action? No, I would not. I would say he's still morally degenerate. The morals have not changed of the individual, just the actions.
Stop shifting, please.
Okay. I'm not. It's really simple.
You're talking about you went to like moral degeneracy. For example,
that's the literal definition of corruption. That's the literal definition.
Moral degenerate. That's way too broad of a definition.
Morally degenerate and perverted. That's what it is.
Okay, listen. What? Okay. I'm sorry. Let me.
It's literally the definition.
Okay. So sadly, it seems like your definition of corruption tends to disagree with like most sociological and like criminological definitions.
Show me.
Because the one that I mentioned necessarily goes against that, right?
No. Which one? Show me the definition. Show me. Which one? I'm reading this. Literally, that's word for word. Morally degenerate and perverted. Show me a legal definition that differs from that.
Police corruption is a form of police misconduct in which law enforcement officers end up breaking their political contract and abuse their power for personal gain.
Would that be morally degenerate, would you say?
Yes, but corruption is not just moral degeneracy.
Is it perverted, would you say?
No, I don't know.
Do you know the definition of perverted?
Can you give me the definition? Because if you're trying to say
really simple.
Sure, go for it.
Corrupt.
That's the
perversion
definition.
Is when it comes to police
definition of perverted
corruption
is corrupt.
Wait, corrupt in what sense? Actually, what do you mean by corrupt? You mean morally corrupt, or when it comes to institutions? There's a difference.
They both fall under the same definition. It's 1A and 1B. 1B would be characterized by improper conduct, such as bribery or the selling of favors. But obviously, as you can see, that these two are grouped together because they obviously work together.
Okay, so when it comes to police
they would both be morally degenerate and perverted. So police corruption is institutional police actions that are morally degenerate and perverted, which is characterized by improper conduct. That's what corrupt is.
By the standard that you set, okay? By the standard that you specifically set, are you defining corruption by law too? If like misusing their power? Because if we have a police system where we don't necessarily morally agree with them.
Yes, by definition, when you say misusing your power, that would be improper conduct.
Okay. Let me finish. Okay? So specifically, when we talk about police corruption, we're specifically referring to them to misuse the powers that were granted to them. Right?
Sure.
So when we look at the quantity of that, you initially said that you don't have the ability to quantify it, and you think that if one of them engages in one corrupt action, the other one engages in 5 corrupt actions, one of these that they're both just as equally corrupt, correct?
Sure, I would say yes. Yes, they are both corrupt. Yes.
Okay.
Equally.
If you had the ability, okay. So then why do you think corruption matters actually?
Because if the entire reason that we have you, if your whole job is to be like sort of the arbiter of justice, then if you're corrupt and you're the arbiter of justice, then that means that justice won't actually be fairly and equally applied.
Sure.
That's why.
How do you think we should deal with corruption?
By punishing it, like within the judicial system.
Sure. Let's say we have a limited amount of resources and we want to deal with corruption in our society. We got $1,000. We have Station A, has 1 corrupt action. Station B has 5 corrupt actions. You can't spend your money on both of them. You can only spend it on one. They're just as equally as corrupt in your standard. So which one would you target?
So I think, I would think that you would target both. I don't think we would ignore either of them. So what you would do,
Let's say
though,
let's
hold
say you could
on.
only go to one.
What we would do in our legal system is we would punish
I'm not.
them.
I'm just giving a hypothetical.
I
I'm not
got you.
necessarily looking at the legal.
I'm always going to subscribe to the legal system. That's what I'm going to do. I'm not going to arbitrarily decide these things for you. I'm literally just going to always subscribe to the law. That's what I do. That's who I am. That's who I am. I'm not arbitrary. I'm not going to do it.
Wait.
It's that simple.
I have a question. Okay, I have
Go
a question.
ahead.
If the law was like tomorrow that we should re-enslave black people, and you're like, man, I subscribe to the law, would you follow and be like, man, I guess I'm okay with just being a slave?
No, I would not.
But I thought you abide by the law. Like, that's how you do everything.
What
right?
I'm saying is I'm going to always subscribe to the law when it comes to applying justice in situations. That's what I'm going to subscribe to unless I feel...
So wait.
Hold on. Unless I feel that the law in question violates some obvious abject moral principle. In that case, then yeah, I would say that. So if the law says you got to start raping folks, then I'm going to say I'm breaking that law. I'm not going to do that. I'm obviously going to subscribe to my own... to my belief system.
So then you subscribe to the moral principles, not necessarily the legal aspects, because those legal aspects are downstream from your moral principles, right?
So, wait, I'm sorry, say it one more time.
You specifically said initially. Okay, so you were talking about, if that violates an abstract moral principle, if the legal system does that, then you subscribe by your moral principles. That's like your fundamental aspect, not the... Okay, so I have a question. Let's say that, like, in this hypothetical situation, right, because the law can be altered, laws can still have been altered. Let's say tomorrow this is the only way that we can do it. So that initial hypothetical, you only have a limited amount of money. You can only target one police system, one police district. One of these police districts is does one act of corruption a week, and the other one does 5 corrupt actions. Okay, let's just say hypothetically that the investigators can take a bus, right? Like, they got to take a bus to only one area, money's tight or some shit, right?
Sure.
And they're like, which one should we stop? Which form of corruption, should we end up trying to go stop if we can only do one of them?
I would probably find a way of measuring.
I'd
find a way of measuring the amount of harm. So, for example, if one person, so maybe the one police station is just doing one action, but that one action is just they're raping a woman a day. Okay, and then the other one is doing a thing like, I don't know, they're just writing people more tickets. They're writing more tickets.
Okay,
so then I'm going to depend I think that the raping of a woman.
So let me go further.
So I'm going to stop that one.
So let me help you out. Okay, let's say that it's all bribery. Okay, and one of them is bribing $1,000 a week to a local elected official, one of the city council members, and the other one, the police are like, they're doing 5 city council members, okay? They're corrupting each one of those, okay? Same type of corruption, right? And they're doing it for all of them, right?
Sure.
So, you got your bus of investigators. Which one are you going to go to in order to stop?
So you're saying
if you only have a little amount of money.
So you're saying if it's 1x and 5x, which one would I go for? I would go for 5x.
Yes. Why?
5x, huh? Because they're literally doing the exact same action, but just one's higher. Sure.
Would you say that one causes more harm than the other?
They cause the same amount of harm, but it's occurring more frequently.
You think that one city council member being bribed, you think that's just as much harm as 5 city council?
I'm sorry.
Harm.
Sorry. Hey, what did you hear me just say? What did you hear me just say? What was my response to that? What did I say?
I know. That's why I'm about to address it again. I know. That's why I was about to correct myself.
Okay.
So I'm not talking about the actual the specific example, each one of those X. I'm talking about the collective action of that police system, right? Do you think that police station B corrupting or bribing 5 city council members, do you think that's causing just as much harm as station A that's only bribing 1 city council member?
No, it's not, because one of them is occurring more frequently, so then there's a measurable difference in harm.
So do you think that we can measure corruption by the amount of harm that it does, and that's how we should deal with it?
Sure, if the variables are identical, then sure, we can do that. So in this situation, as we said, 1x versus 5x, and 5x is going to be larger. But you can't tell me that 1x is going to be larger than 2y. You can't tell me that 1x is going to be larger than 10y. And so that's why I keep saying we can't quantify the difference. Because if we're talking about the corruption from the bosses doing whatever the freak they're doing, and then we're talking about the corruption such as what's being sued by New York Attorney General Letitia, whatever her last name is, Letitia James, you can't quantify those two. They're different variables. It's 1x versus 1y. You don't know the difference in these two. That's why they're unquantifiable. quantifiable. But in this specific hypothetical that you're giving me, in which the variables are identical, and you're telling me that one is just occurring more frequently, which is why I use the formula 1x versus 5x, in that situation, I would obviously go for the one that's 5x. But these are not the same things, because you can't quantify what Letitia James is doing, because her case hasn't been settled. We don't know what the trial is going to amount to, so you can't quantify those two versus what the previous thing. Which is why I said you can't say that there's been some subsiding injustice. You can't quantify it. That's the difference.
Okay. So you keep bringing up this one specific example. You're right. They haven't set a sentence on it, so I really can't know. Okay, I don't know the minimums for it. Right? It may be a specific type of crime. You said it's did you say it was impossible to measure corruption and like the harm that it does?
No. There's ways you can measure the harm that it does. I mean, depending on how you measure certain things, that we can measure economic impact of specific policies.
Okay. Just okay. So,
sure.
Do you think that the legal system is able to do that?
To quantify it?
Do you think the legal system has the ability to quantify specific forms of harm, even if it's wrong or not? Do you think that they do it?
I don't know that they can necessarily quantify it, but they do place value judgments on things.
They do quantify the amount of harm. That's how they deal with it, right?
Not necessarily. It's based on value judgments. It's not necessarily quantified. It's sometimes very arbitrary, your point was earlier that it is arbitrary sometimes. Was it not? You made the point out of your mouth that it was arbitrary earlier.
I made that point that it was arbitrary on the basis of what you were talking about. That if you consider like the example, like if you consider the way that that's arbitrary, then the way that we deal with the legal system is arbitrary. I don't think that's the reason. I don't think that it's arbitrary. Right? I may disagree with some of the way that they do it in some aspects, but I don't think it's arbitrary.
Okay, let me give you an example of something that's arbitrary then, right?
Okay, can you just let me finish my point? Okay.
Go ahead.
Okay. So specifically, if the legal system can engage with this, how would we do this, right? If the legal system tends to quantify it by at least, like putting people up for certain sentences and putting regulations, do you think that like the legal system, let's say that we had a political boss case today, right? And as I mentioned, like the back to that initial example, which you kind of strayed away from, and we had that one, that we had that small case of bribery, right? The legal system inherently quantifies it, then engages, and like they dedicate a certain amount of resources to keep these individuals locked up in case with others. So they quantify it to a certain extent, even if we don't necessarily agree with that quantification. That's how you do it. That's how the legal system does it. I may not necessarily agree with every single thing that they do, but they do it off the basis of something, whether I necessarily disagree with it or not. We do quantify corruption. I mean, we do it in our legal system all the time.
But we understand. But you're arguing. But you're sure that it's arbitrary, correct?
It depends on the case. The specific law may be arbitrary.
So sometimes it is arbitrary. Yes.
Sometimes it is arbitrary, but not the whole system is in and of itself arbitrary. For example, depending on the way that laws are set, actually arbitrary without necessarily a set definition is kind of a weird way of looking at it. Because, for example, for like judiciary philosophies, it may be deontological, that the way that they engage with law. That's like law derives from ethics, so I don't know if it would necessarily be arbitrary. In the sense of like, let's hope that they set some standard, right? That's how the Constitution engaged. That's how state constitutions engage, is on the basis of like how we should deal with a crime on the basis of precedent. So I don't know. I don't even know, like, I kind of take that back. I don't even know if it's arbitrary. So we already quantify corruption.
So now you're walking back the point that you used earlier when you told me specifically that the way we determine our laws are arbitrary. But that's okay. I'll let you walk that back. But let me ask you a question really quick. Would you say that our determination on the differences in laws, would you say that it's based on would you say that it's based on the intrinsic value or the intrinsic nature of the crimes? Would you say that that's how we determine the length of punishing sentences of sentences for various crimes? Is it based on the intrinsic nature of things?
It depends on the judicial the philosophy that individuals are engaging with. So, like, if a state if someone wants to engage with, that'd be the standard that they do it by, right? So, you mentioned like whether it was intention or not. So, a lot of times, state legislatures may engage with it in a form of deontological way or consequentialist way, or engaging with some form of divine theory to derive a law.
So then, if it varies, then that means it's not intrinsic, correct?
No, that's not. You said intrinsic in that, like, as the crime, in the sense of like this. Can you restate your initial point?
When we determine the lengths of various things, do we base the length on some intrinsic nature of the thing? The answer is no, right? It's really simple. This is the point that I'm making. I don't have to ask this, and I'm not. We don't have to do this in categorization. It's really simple. We do things, even in our judicial system, very arbitrarily, which I readily conceded when you brought up this point earlier. I get you want to walk it back now because it's inconvenient for your current point, but that's fine. So the thing is, we do things very arbitrarily, and a perfect example of that would be like something like the crack cocaine disparity, where we recognize that there is 100 to 1 disparity. There was for like literally over 3 decades between crack cocaine and powder cocaine, even though pharmacologically those things are identical. We decided, because crack cocaine was was consumed by blacks more, that we would give that one, the rock version of it, we would give it 100. We had 100 to 1 disparity. So for having 5 grams of that, it would have a 10-year minimum sentence, versus having 500 grams of the powder version of the cocaine, we would have a 5 whatever. That was completely arbitrary. That was definitely not based on the intrinsic nature of what cocaine is. It was very arbitrary, and then we later on modified that to give it a 10 to 1 ratio, which is indicative of the fact that it's arbitrary, because it wasn't like cocaine changed dramatically or crack cocaine changed dramatically. We as a society decided that we could modify those things, and we find that these things are modified on a regular basis, which is indicative of the fact that it is arbitrary. The fact that we have a governing body of people that can completely usurp or change, modify the amount of time that is served over these things, means that it has to be arbitrary. It cannot be intrinsic by definition. So yeah, we do decide these things arbitrarily quite regularly. But I subscribe to whatever the laws of the society says. I do think that there are things there are times that those things need to be modified. We obviously had a Supreme Court justice decide at one point. We had the Supreme Court decide that separate but equal was fair. We recognize that sometimes human beings can be in error. But if you're asking me as a layperson to make a judgment about things, I'm always going to subscribe to the law, unless, of course, again, it violates some of the moral principles. There are laws that are unconstitutional, and I would say this sounds like this is unconstitutional. But this isn't. You haven't presented me with any kind of case like that.
You muted.
I was just bringing up the fact that, like, by your standard earlier, if we were to engage that way, then the legal system would in and of itself be arbitrary, right?
It is. I agree.
I don't actually. Legal system in and of its whole is not arbitrary, because it's on the basis of the Constitution. The Constitution comes from specific philosophers, and the way that we handle with like man's right, for example, which I don't necessarily agree with, right? It's not just for no reason. Even when we have a system where things are able to change, it's off the basis of democracy. It's not arbitrary, and democracy comes from some form of philosophical standpoint behind it. Yes, some laws do seem to be arbitrary just off the base of moral intuition and no like just personal choice rather than a system. And yes, that may happen, but not all laws, nor is the whole complete legal system arbitrary. And that's a specific point that I wanted to get to, right?
That's wrong.
So when it comes to what? Oh my god!
So if it's not arbitrary, then okay, help me. Good. You're right. I'm sorry. Maybe you were 100% right. Help me understand it. Maybe I'm misunderstanding something. Explain to me what about murder specifically says 25 years. Why is it 25 and not 26 and not 24 or not 27 and not 23? Explain to me, what is it intrinsically about murder that says 25 years even? Why?
Okay, so specifically, that may be for the reason that we believe at that point in and of itself, it'll cause the least amount of harm, or we believe that on the basis of like some form of deontological framework, that as a punishment, as a way of discouraging individuals from like engaging in murder again, that we set a high standard or a high bar. I didn't say everything was arbitrary. I didn't say that like the whole thing isn't arbitrary. To a certain extent, some laws may be. But this is the basis of a philosophical system behind it. I never made the claim. Like I just said, not all things. Like, and I just mentioned that like not and it's not completely unarbitrary. There's some aspects that are arbitrary. So the basis of having a long time period. Like I said that. I clearly said
okay,
that.
Good. So I got you. So yeah, it isn't. So you're walking it back to. So first you're saying it's not arbitrary at all. Now you're saying it's not completely arbitrary.
I already addressed that point, dude. Oh my god.
So it is partially arbitrary. It is partially arbitrary that we decided 25 and not 26. Or otherwise, you have to be able to prove me a reason why we said succinctly 25.
I said that. Wait, I said that. I said that not the whole part of the judiciary system or the legal system is completely off the basis of philosophical systems, and stuff is arbitrary. Some of it is arbitrary.
Okay, so some of it is arbitrary. Okay. All right, so then
I never disagreed with that.
You were walking it back earlier. You were saying, I'm not sure it's even arbitrary just a second ago. You were literally making that statement, and I was saying that was a point that you made earlier.
I'm not sure. Wait. I just made the claim that I'm not sure. When did I make a definitive statement that it was? I came to the realization during that sentence. When did I make the definitive claim that it wasn't?
No, you never point blank said that it wasn't.
Why are
What
you saying that I said that? What the
no,
fuck?
what you
Oh my god!
what you originally said. No, what you no. Matter of fact, I'm sorry. Just a few minutes ago, you actually made the statement that it wasn't arbitrary. You said actually it's not arbitrary because it's based on moral systems based off of an individual and the philosophers that we have at the time. That's why you literally said it wasn't arbitrary and then walked down the reasons why it wasn't arbitrary. That you just did that out of your own freaking mouth. Am I wrong? Tell me I'm lying. You said the words, it's not arbitrary, it's based off of these moral philosophers, blah, 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 blah. Those words came out of your mouth, it's not arbitrary. Did you say that or yes or no?
Yeah, I did say that.
Okay, so first you did say it was arbitrary. You brought that argument up to me, and you said it was arbitrary. Then afterwards, now you walked it back to it's not arbitrary, and now you're walking it back again after I cornered you again and said, okay, yeah, you're right, it's arbitrary. Bodied. You keep flip flopping back and forth every time you recognize that your position isn't tenable. Is it arbitrary or not?
Do you think that something can be somewhat arbitrary as well as off the basis of a philosophical principle at the same time?
Can it be off the basis of a philosophical? Can it be off the basis of a philosophical principle and still be arbitrary? Yes,
it's somewhat arbitrary. Do you think that those two things could coexist?
So now you're trying to like quantify how arbitrary it is?
I'm just saying that it's okay.
Okay.
Because first,
either it's arbitrary or it's intrinsic. It's that simple. If it's not intrinsic, it's arbitrary.
No,
okay.
Because
okay.
Because
so I know. This has been fun and interesting. All right. So what's gonna happen to my audience? We're actually going to move on to our pop list roundtable, which is regularly scheduled here at 10 p.m. Eastern. So this is an interesting thing. Thank you both for taking part in this. Right. So
we got to get closing statements, though.
Yeah, I just literally said I'm going to give you an outro. You can
okay. Sorry.
Okay. Yeah. So go ahead. But make it short because we do have to move on.
You're right.
So, all right, we'll start with you, Fanatiq.
Okay, so at the end of the day, the thing that I was defining from the very beginning is that our police system from its inception until now has always been very corrupt. If you look up the history of what policing was used for, what its intentions were, it hasn't very much been modified. The entire intention behind the police were to subjugate blacks, specifically in the South. And we recognize that the way the police interact now is very nefariously with African Americans particularly. And so I don't think that there's been some sort of change in civil rights. Change in the way that the policing is applied. We recognize there's an over-policing of black people. There's constant violation of black civil rights. We had the Supreme Court rule on civil rights, and then even still, it didn't change very much. So we had Martin Luther King complaining about civil rights literally in 1967. Until he was murdered in 1967. And now in 2021, we're still campaigning and fighting for the same thing. Just last year, we saw a man kneel on George Floyd's neck for freaking 8 minutes. We had the Watts riots. We had the freaking LA riots in 92. There hasn't been a very drastic change. We have literally lawsuits right now from 2020 from the entire police NYPD literally violating the civil rights of the vast majority of their constituents. We've had broken door policing and broken window policing. Nothing has changed. Corruption is inherent to this police station. To police in the United States of America. I think until we completely reimagine the entire system as a whole, it will always be corrupt, as we've seen it be corrupt for literally over 200 years. And I don't think anything is going to change about that. Policing is corrupt. We do need to reimagine the system as a whole. Policing does not prevent crime. Policing is not going to prevent someone from murdering. It's not going to prevent someone from burglarizing. Now, what they can do is chase down the individual that does it, and they can punish the individual that does it. We have detectives for those kind of things, but the idea of police patrolling in order to prevent crime is absolutely ludicrous. We recognize it's ineffective in every form that we've ever applied it. Police, we do need to completely restructure this entire system.
Okay. Go ahead. Well, thank you for that, and tell the audience where they can find you.
Okay, you can find me twitch.tv/Mr. Fanatiq. You can find me on YouTube. I think there's a YouTube channel called Ask Fanatiq where I upload stuff. I'll probably upload this. And you can find me on Prime K's debates. I mean, not his debates, his panels very often. Sometimes like on a Thursday for the black folks, because that's the one that I care about the most. That's the one they invite me to the most. That's the one I'm the most passionate about because I'm a nigga, so I care about niggas. But I care about everybody. But that's where I am typically on Thursdays and sometimes on Mondays. I typically spice things up. I go a little ham, but I do love everybody. I think Polar's World is particularly intelligent. I just think he waffled a lot on these topics, but you'll find me around Prime Case Channel mostly.
Okay, all right. Well, great. And also, of course, you have your music.
Yeah, don't worry about that. That's not on this topic. I'm sorry. We'll worry about that. Sorry.
Okay. All right.
I love you though. You're the best.
Polar, your outro on this, your closing statement and your outro.
Yeah, I think this was an interesting debate to say the least. I'd like to look back at one specific point. We defined what police was by talking about how they are a group of people that has been recognized by the federal government in order to use coercive forces to enforce the laws that this government sets out. And specifically, I asked Fanatiq, hey Fanatiq, do you think in the future at one point, do you think like the police could ever exist this way? Actually, I'm sorry. Do you think that like police could ever like not be corrupt? And he's like, oh yeah, it'd be so different that we like wouldn't really consider them police anymore. But then I asked him, hey, if we use these same standards, would they like that? Like if we use those same standards, he said, yeah, that would still apply to that specific group of like future law enforcement. Oh, that would still be police. So I mean, even in this debate, like Fanatiq already kind of conceded the initial point very quickly by specifically referring to a future enforcement agency that would still abide by the rules of what we consider police right now, and they wouldn't be corrupt. So, I mean, you probably should have stopped it there. As a result, you kind of flip-flopped a lot. Things have changed a lot. Even if they're still pretty bad right now, I would say that like when you have cases of like police consistently hanging individuals, using political bosses in order to like sway whole elections, having things like the Bureau of Internal Affairs as a way to deal with corruption, that's a progression. I would also say that black people, even though they're treated pretty badly by the police today, are treated better than they were 120 years ago under Jim Crow. And I think anyone who says that is, I don't know, probably needs to go read a history book. But yeah, those are my points. I think, my name is Polar. You can find me. I do politics and stuff. Fanatiq, it was interesting to talk to you. I think we disagreed. But it was still an interesting conversation to say the least. Twitch.tv/Polar's World. I'm streaming right now and do political content, all that good stuff. And I am on Prime's panels a lot. So cool.
Okay. All right. So what's going to happen is we're going to roll on to our pop list panel, a pop list roundtable. Not our walk-on panel, we're a pop list roundtable, which Polar is going to be a part of. So I guess we'll say au revoir.
I can't make it tonight. I have to go after this. Yeah.
Seriously? You're telling me right now?
Yeah. I told Spectre because Spectre was the one who invited me. I thought Spectre was. Did Spectre not tell you? I'm sorry about that.
Okay. Well, all right. Bye, everyone. See ya. Yep. Okay. And we're so we'll go on to our pop list panel. Bring in other people. You guys can just leave the word bye because I'm going to use it right now.
All right. Peace out, man. Love you guys. Catch you later. Yeah, that's a conversation. That was rough. There's a lot of videos that you can watch on this topic. It's pretty freaking obvious at the end of the day. One of the things that I would like to show you guys, here's a big article on it, on just like the history of policing and what it is. But I was 100% accurate in the idea that he did absolutely, in the middle of when we were arguing, say, well, our whole system is arbitrary. And I was like, okay, I agree. It is very arbitrary. Then he goes later on and says, I'm not sure it's arbitrary. Actually, it's not arbitrary because it's based on the philosopher. It's like, it's very much arbitrary. So then I have to like hammer you down on, so how do we determine between 25 years or 24 years or 26 years? How is that determined? Well, we're determining how much harm it's going to do. Well, how do you quantify that? Is it part of the intrinsic nature of freaking murder? No, it is arbitrary, and you know that. And then it's like, well, parts of it are arbitrary, literally. So you first said it's arbitrary and thought that you would get me on that, where it's like, yeah, it is arbitrary, but at least I subscribe to this thing because that's the one way that we can be I can be objective in the sense that I subscribe to this arbitrary thing, right? But then the second thing is, then you later on walk it back like, it's not arbitrary at all, because you realize it's not working to your point. Then you go back and say, I never said that. Where did I say it wasn't arbitrary? Nigga, you waffled. It's that simple. First you said it was arbitrary, then you said it wasn't, then you said it was. The thing is, at the end of the day, it is arbitrary. But that's fine. I get it. Because it's really hard to, the idea, I don't know how else we would ever come up with the idea for a punishment for certain things. What's to say that freaking molestation should be 10 years versus murder 25 versus extortion 7? How do you come up with these numbers? Obviously it's freaking arbitrary. The thing is, at the end of the day, at least we recognize that though the way we came up with the rules and the application of it is arbitrary, what we can hope for, the thing that I dream for, is the idea that the application of the punishment won't be arbitrary. I hate the idea of a judge being able to decide that for Brock Turner, rape was 6 months. I hate that. That is arbitrary, because very clearly I can point to plenty of other cases from other judges, even in the same state, in the same county, that different judges would say different things. I promise you that wasn't the very first case that judge ruled on a rape case for someone, and I promise you that he's had different sentences. It's not like he always decides 6 months for rape for that. That was arbitrary. The application, prosecutorial discretion, is arbitrary as hell. It amounts for the largest factor when it comes to the sentence disparity between blacks and whites. So the application of the law is arbitrary. The application of policing is arbitrary. The deciding factors for how we come up with the length and terms of punishment is arbitrary. Everything about this thing is arbitrary. So the idea that we would even ever argue that it's not is absolutely ridiculous. But I, as an individual, don't like trying to make our arbitrary distinction there. I wouldn't decide, like, I'm going to decide arbitrarily which one's worse than that. Like, no, I'm not going to do that. I'm going to subscribe to the law, even though I know that the law is arbitrary, but at least I can be objective in saying whatever the law says, that's what it is. That's what it is.